Good evening, everyone. I'm Art Fennell. Thanks for being here. You know, we live in a fascinating and turbulent time. America is more politically polarized than it has been in ages. And add to that the explosion of technology, where it seems just about anything you want is just a point and a click away. Put that together, and what have you got? Well, a public that has more options than ever before when it comes to getting information. Could be a good thing, right? But then, who do you trust to give you all of that information? An anchor, a pundit, a blog? And given all those choices we have today, a lot of people are simply, well, tuning out. Let's talk about this. Our AFR correspondent Jam Sardar is here now to tackle these questions and more. Jam?
That's right. Art, I'm sure you remember the days of the big three. Now, we're not just talking about the car companies, we're talking about the networks. Some of you may remember a day when the only place you could turn to for news, or for anything on TV for that matter, was ABC, NBC, and CBS. But times have changed. You've got hundreds of channels to watch just about anything you want to see. That's why fewer and fewer people are turning into the network news, and information in the form of written word or on video is just a point and click away. But who can you trust in this day and age? Who's a journalist? And what's the future of journalism? I sat down with former network news anchor Dan Rather to talk about the current and future face of news. You're doing an hour-long special on the state of journalism today, and you started by asking your panelists, is there a crisis in news? Let me turn the tables and ask you, do you think there's a crisis in news?
I do. And I think the crisis has to do with the fact that we, and I include myself in this criticism, in some important ways, we've lost the grit in our gut. I've said before that we need a spine transplant. What's a journalist's job? A journalist's job is to help the consumer of news separate brass tacks from bullshit. The job of the journalist is to be an honest broker of information, or at least the kind of journalist I want to be and many journalists want to be. That carries with it the responsibility of having the guts to stand up, ask this tough question. But I think a lot of it gets down to just having the courage to do what journalists are supposed to do and worry far less about the criticism you may get.
Because we failed to ask some of the hard questions and find out the truth in some of these stories, do you think there's a crisis in confidence in that the American people have in journalists?
Certainly there's an increased lack of confidence in journalists, and I understand it, and I think in many ways it's valid. Once again saying I do not accept myself from this criticism. Ideally, journalists should aspire to be truth tellers and truth sayers. And I think we've gotten a little bit away from that, at least a little bit away from it, because we've become, as I say, intimidated. And the politicians have learned ever better ways to manipulate us, and very important that viewers understand, to manipulate our bosses and the owners of major news outlets.
I know you have a lot of respect for the audience, but let me ask you, a lot of people don't seem to be interested in the fiasco at the Justice Department and with the U.S. attorney firings. And at the same time, I think a lot of people wouldn't show wall-to-wall Paris Hilton if there wasn't an audience for it and if people weren't tuning in.
Well,
in that respect, is the audience part of the problem?
Well, of course the audience is part of the problem, but we journalists can't use that as an excuse. But I will say this, you mentioned what's happening in the Justice Department. It's true, a lot of people say, Justice Department doesn't affect me. It's part of the journalist's job to tell people, by using facts, being accurate, being fair, of why it means something to them. Here's the point, that yes, it's incumbent on journalists to do the best they can to convey what's going on, what's really going on, but it is incumbent on the audience to pay attention.
Now, we can lead with important stories on, say, Iraq or Afghanistan, but how do we compete then with the people who want news of a particular slant have their channel? People who like game shows or sports have their own entire networks.
Right.
Is the fractionalization of the media a problem?
The fractionalization of the audience is a reality. And you say, how can we compete with it? The first thing is to know who you are, to be authentic and say, listen, if you want to watch Paris Hilton, if you want to watch the game shows, there are plenty of places to do that. But when you hang out the sign news and you say it's a newscast or a news channel, or I'm a news person, then I think that the audience ought to have a reasonable expectation that that's what they're going to get. There are plenty of places that say they're doing news when they're in fact doing one of two things. They're even doing celebrity sort of columns of the air, and or they're just having shouting contests. Now, these programs may have value, and a lot of people may watch them, but they're not news programs.
You had Ted Koppel on your show as one of your panelists, and you asked him the same question that was going through my mind. So who's to say that, it seems to be a crisis now that, say these two old guys have left the network? Is it easy to look back and say, well, now I'm gone, now there's a crisis?
Listen, I'm not arguing that news was always better when I was at one of the big networks. I'm not arguing that we did it the best anybody's ever done it. That's a different thing. But I do think it's time to pause and say, are those of us in news serving the country as well as we could and should? Are we doing enough investigative reporting? Are we asking enough tough questions? Are we doing a public service? Because news at its best is a public service. Because let's have this clearly understood. In a constitutional republic based on the principles of freedom and democracy, it's absolutely essential to have informed citizens. If that falls apart, what have we and what will we have?
Well, Dan Rather came into our homes for many, many years, and I've had an opportunity to speak with him in the past. He is a classic example of one of the old school journalists, the purebreds in the industry, but he acknowledges, doesn't he, that things are changing and very quickly.
Absolutely, and that's one of the reasons that it's so important to realize what's happening, to educate ourselves, and not just ourselves, but future generations on the line between news and propaganda. Anybody can be a journalist. Anybody can give themselves the title of a journalist. You don't need a certification, or you don't need a state government or anybody to tell you who's a journalist and who is not. And that's why we have to be careful and realize who we can trust and decide what is news and what is propaganda.
I enjoyed his comment when he said the journalist is an honest broker of information. You know, we touched on this as sort of a hybrid topic not that long ago when we talked about the Keith Olbermanns and the Bill O'Reillys of the world and their types of programming. We got some feedback on that from some of our viewers and one viewer in particular said that, look, we're not stupid. We can tell the difference between who's a journalist and what's a blog and what's just information and entertainment. And Dan Rather also mentions that we've got to give the audience more credit too, doesn't he?
Absolutely. He says we do, but we also need to be careful. A lot of people can tell the difference between news and opinion, but one of the things we need to be careful of is that people, with the more choice we have in this on-demand world, when they'll be able to read whatever newspaper and whatever articles they want, in a day when instead of watching the news at 6 o'clock, we can go on the web and pick and choose the stories that we want, that we need to make sure that people get the important stories and not just, say, the Paris Hilton stories or the light fluffy stories.
Yeah.
We need to make sure they get the stories that they need as well as the ones they want.
Well, you did cover a lot of ground from Paris Hilton to the Justice Department. What's Dan Rather doing now?
Dan Rather is putting together, actually this show was part of a show he does called Dan Rather Reports. This show will be seen on his channel called HDNet. They haven't picked a specific date, but they're looking to air this sometime in August. And you'll see that show with Dan Rather, with Ted Koppel, and with a few people from the Annenberg School of Communication.
All right, well, we'll be looking out for it. I've always enjoyed his work. Jam, good stuff.
All right.
Always. Thank you very much, sir. All right. Well, now this, what do you think about it? You know, how will you get your news in the future, and what will the future of network news look like? Is TV news going to be a thing of the past as you know it now? Email me your thoughts on this at cn8.tv, and then you can click on the icon for Art Fennell Reports.